Hi everyone, thanks for joining me again. It's Allison with the Everyday Scrapbooker, and I'm here today to share with you a brand new stamping technique. It's brand new to me, maybe it is to you as well, and it's called the rock and roll. I decided to create a card using this technique, so I pulled out some toffee cardstock and stamped the leaf image in different places around the cardstock using toffee ink. So I did happen to get some ink on the foam pad that comes with my stamp sets. Typically I like to have scratch paper behind the cardstock that I'm stamping on. This time I didn't. Cleaning it up is really simple. All you need is a baby wipe. That's typically what I use. And just wipe it off to clean off the foam pad that comes with your stamp set. And I haven't experienced yet any staining from any of the colors that I stamp with. And now for the fun part. This is where I am testing out the rock and roll stamping technique. So I just took some white daisy cardstock, scrap paper obviously. I chose the inks that I wanted to stamp with and then the stamp that I wanted to use as well, which happens to be the same leaf stamp that I used on the toffee cardstock just a little while ago. Okay, so this is how the rock and roll stamping technique works. After you've chosen the stamp that you want to use, you're going to choose the lightest color ink that you plan on using and filling up your stamp with that color ink. The next color that you're going to use should be darker than the one that you just chose, and you're going to very lightly roll that stamp across the darker color ink. And then you're ready to stamp on your paper. To make sure I got the darker ink in a few different places around the stamp, I rolled it a few different directions over the saffron, which was the darker color that I used, ink pad, just to make sure some of the different points on the maple leaf and the stem also got some of the saffron ink as well. For the purpose of this particular card, I wanted to use a few different colors just for variation and just to see what each of the colors look like when you mix them together using this particular technique. With the greens, I don't think I got enough of the fern, the darker green on the stamp because I have a hard time telling the difference between the sweet leaf, so the lighter green, and where the darker fern green is as well. I ran out of space to stamp more leaves on this particular piece of scrap cardstock, so I grabbed another piece of white daisy and continued on with more stamping. So I stamped one more leaf, I think, and I used espresso and sangria ink. And once I had that leaf done, I went ahead and cut them out using the thin cuts that coordinates with this particular stamp set. This stamp set that I used is the Hawthorne scrapbooking stamp set and coordinates with the Hawthorne paper collection from Close to My Heart. I flipped the cardstock over here because I think I was using two colors that were too similar in nature. It was really hard for me to tell the difference between the espresso and the sangria colors. However, even though it didn't work out the way that I had anticipated, I still liked the finished product, so I ended up using this leaf on my card. Stamping with the sangria ink is really messy. I don't know if you found that or not, but anytime I've used it, I found that it always leaves a red residue behind on my stamps, even though I clean it, and also on my stamping block. So I go back cleaning it with a baby wipe just to make sure I get all of that ink off of my stamp and my stamping block. So now that I have my leaves cut out, I just arranged them on the toffee cardstock, just kind of placing them around to see what I like the best. And then I go ahead and glue the toffee cardstock to a slightly larger espresso cardstock base. And then I go back and put the leaves on again, just playing with placement and seeing what I like the best. I wanted to make sure that some of the stamping in the background was still visible, even though the rock and rolled leaves were going to be placed on top. I adhered the leaves with foam dots as well, just to add a little bit of dimension. To give the feeling that the leaves were actually falling from the tree to the ground, I made sure that the leaves were placed on the card in different directions as well. Once I get all my rock and rolled leaves stuck to the card base, it takes just a little bit longer here to get that done, I move on to stamping the sentiment. And the sentiment comes from October's Stamp of the Month. Now I'm getting pretty close now to finishing putting my rock and rolled leaves onto the card base. Once I have that done, I use S1910 Autumn Air to stamp I Love Fall on the card base. And I did that using espresso ink. I discovered as I was about to stamp I Love Fall on the card base that the bottom leaf was placed just a little too far in on the card base. Fall wouldn't really fit all that well if I wanted to stamp it, so I ended up moving the one leaf over just a little bit to make room for the word fall. And it was at this point that I had a brainwave and thought that maybe if I changed the orientation of the card, fitting I Love Fall onto the card base would work a little bit better. But rather than changing the entire card, because I had 3/4 of it done already, I decided to go ahead and make a second card in a horizontal orientation instead of vertical. That's coming up in just a minute. Instead of playing around with trying to move the sangria leaf, I ended up just taking it off for the time being, stamping fall, and then followed it up with I love. And then once I had everything where I wanted it, as you can see, I was playing around just to see if I could add most of all, that's the stamp that I had in my hand, to the very bottom, but I thought it was too close to the bottom of the card base, so I just left it alone. I put my sangria leaf back onto the card base and then added the entire mat to the card base. And as promised, here comes the vertical orientation card that I had mentioned just a few minutes ago. So I used the same color cardstock. This is toffee cardstock. And instead of stamping the maple leaf in toffee ink like I had done previously, I actually kind of forgot that I had used toffee. I just grabbed my espresso and used that to stamp the leaves on the base mat. I followed the same procedure with this card as well. So stamping the leaves on the cardstock base, I changed the stamp around just to give it the look of different leaves falling from a tree. So they're not all headed in the same direction. They're coming from different places. And up next is my new favorite stamping technique, the rock and roll stamping technique. So I used the same colors here again. I used fern and sweet leaf and my peach and saffron. And instead of using espresso and sangria when I get to that leaf, instead I used toffee and sangria. And it's so much easier now to see the difference between the two colors. There's enough of a contrast between the two of them that you can see what is toffee and what is sangria. So just remember, if you use this technique, make sure the colors that you use has enough of a contrast between them that you're not fighting to differentiate between any of the colors. I did my cutting off camera again just to speed up the process and prevent you from getting bored. I matted my toffee cardstock on a slightly larger piece of espresso cardstock and then arranged my leaves around the base in a way that made me happy. Nothing too much has changed from the last card that I showed you to this one. The only difference really is that the orientation is different. I used my foam dots again to provide some depth. And once they all have foam squares on them, I take the backings off them and plop those leaves onto my card base. Once again, I wanted to make sure that some of the espresso leaves in the background was visible between the leaves that were popped up. What do you think of the rock and roll technique on leaves in particular? I haven't tried it on anything else yet. Doesn't it make them look like authentic fall leaves? I just absolutely love this technique and the look that I'm left with on these fall themed leaves. Next comes stamping the sentiment. So I stamped I love fall once again on this card and added most of all at the bottom because I had a little bit more room to play with. All of that will be stamped in espresso ink as well. I moved the fall stamp around just a little bit because I was thinking about maybe filling in that empty space there between the leaves, but then decided that having some empty space probably wouldn't be a bad thing, so I left it where I had it originally. Thanks for joining me today. If you enjoyed this technique and you'd like to learn more stamping techniques like this, click subscribe down at the bottom of this video. And if you're interested in purchasing the Hawthorne stamp and thin cut set, my Close to My Heart website will be linked at the bottom as well. I hope to see you again soon.